Yes.
I suspect you'd have a slightly different view on all of the above. How are you feeling about everything that happened yesterday? Did you watch the inauguration? What is your big picture, 30,000 feet view?
I think it's incredibly unwise to make bold predictions about what's going to happen over the next 6 to 7 months. I do think what America had at the election and what the election of Donald Trump represents is something that we in the UK don't have, which is choice. They had a very clear choice between two very different perspectives on the world, between two very different approaches, between two very different candidates. And ultimately, criticisms of President Trump are necessary and legitimate. Of course they are. But at the end of the day, I believe, having spent quite a lot of time in America around election time and also just generally and traveling around real America, not just in DC and LA and New York, the reason that he was elected was that the American people are not prepared to accept what Europeans have decided they're prepared to accept, which is managed decline. The American people do not want their country to become weaker. They do not want it to become poorer. They do not want to impoverish their fellow citizens through net zero. What they want is their country to be great, their country to be powerful, their country to be influential. The economic realities for most Americans are not really reflected in the figures that we are told. So when people talk about inflation, the reality of people's lives on the ground is that their cost of living has gone up very, very significantly over the last few years. And that's not always reflected directly in the overall inflation figure that we're shown, because certain things are much more influential in people's lives than others. And so whether the decision to elect President Trump ends up being this positive thing for which there should be lots of optimism is a matter of the next 4 years. Are we going to see a presidency that really does everything it promises? And by the way, if you look at the things that Donald Trump is promising, I think whether you're left or right, you have to acknowledge that they are things that are worth doing. Having a secure border so that people don't come into your country illegally is a basic duty of government. Economic prosperity is a basic duty of government. Withdrawing America from a kind of simultaneously aggressive but weak posture around the world, where America sort of says, yeah, we're going to get involved in these foreign conflicts, but we're not actually going to then practically help Ukraine win that war, is a kind of stupid position on both, whichever side you're on. So on all of these things, and of course, Scott mentioned wokeness. I think he's absolutely right that there is a massive backlash happening around the world, because lots and lots of people who were completely apolitical until the last 3 or 4 years, or maybe until 2016, just feel like the world has gone crazy, and suddenly they're supposed to pretend that men can change sex and become women, and now they're entitled to be in female prisons. And if your teenager says that they are the opposite sex, you're supposed to chop their breasts off, and all of this other stuff that ordinary people just look at and go, this is crazy. Like, I am liberal, but this isn't liberal. This is some kind of weird thing that's going on. And I see the backlash against all of that all over the Western world. And I think Donald Trump signifies that people are fed up of that. And I have been warning for a very long time that if the woke left continues to exercise this level of influence on our public debate, the reaction will be the rise of the right. And Donald Trump is one of the most diplomatic and pleasant versions of what you're likely to get if the left keeps going crazy. We will see what challenges the world throws at him over the next 4 years, and whether he's capable of responding to them.
Scott, has the left lost its way, in your view? And if so, how did that happen? And just to respond on some of Konstantin's points about Trump being the best of a sort of right-wing collective, are we going to see right-wing sort of ideology spread throughout the Western world over the coming years? What's your take on all of the above?
You definitely, we Democrats, we get it right, and then we just go too damn far. And so I look at, I'm a professor on a campus. DEI, 60 years ago, there were 12 Black people at Princeton, Yale, and Harvard combined. That was a problem. Race-based affirmative action makes sense. This year, more than half of Harvard's freshman class identifies as non-white. but 70% of those non-whites come from dual income homes in the upper quintile of income earning homes. The academic gap between black and white used to be double what it was between rich and poor. It's now flipped. So DEI was a good idea that, quite frankly, has gone insane and now just represents the same racism it was trying to do away with. So, and then we created two candidates who were the only candidates who could make each other viable. Vice President Harris, given the hand she dealt with, did the best she did. I think President Biden should be buried in a crypt entitled narcissist, who decided that it made sense for him to go back on his pledge to be a transition candidate, and gave us a British-style election timing on the Democratic side without in a marketplace where you need time and money. So it was not. We did not have a great candidate. There is an understandable swing back from what is an overcorrection around some of these issues. Parents, we gave them a huge issue with transgender rights. There's more Padel players in California than transgender people, and yet the Democrats decided to conflate it with the civil rights movement and think that it was okay for a woman who transitioned, a transgender woman, to enter a bicycle race and finish 5 minutes before everybody else, and then we all bark up the same tree and decide that it's inspiring. And parents all over the nation are saying, we've literally gone crazy. Where I would disagree a little bit with Konstantin is that America choosing economic growth and prosperity. There are 190 sovereign nations in the world. 189 would change places with America over the last 4 years. We hit 71 new record highs in the markets, 97% of all AI. We've created more market capitalization in a 7-mile radius of Esevo International Airport than Europe's created in the last 20 years. We have the lowest inflation in the G7. We have the highest growth. We've grown 10% since 2020. That's triple the rate of Europe. Biden was unable to communicate any of that effectively because there's this psychological dynamic that when your wages go up, you credit your own grit and character. And when the price of cereal goes up, you blame the president. Now, similar to the future, or how William Gibson described the future, it's here, it's just not evenly distributed. Prosperity is unprecedented in the US over the last 4 years. It just wasn't evenly distributed. Now, having said that, in America, you can stop working in August and you've produced more and made more money than you have in Europe the whole year. And it has gotten better. It says things are less bad than anywhere in the world in the US. Biden was unable to communicate it. And then talking about how great the economy is when rents were skyrocketing, tuition was going up, it was an ineffective strategy. But I don't think it's fair to say Americans chose prosperity. We have prosperity. I would argue that, quite frankly, some of the Republican ideals around deficit spending, which are nothing but taxes on future generations pulled forward. I mean, we'll see how that works. But his signature policies, a clampdown on immigration, tariffs, these things are wildly inflationary. So Konstantin's right. It's going to be difficult. You don't know what's going to happen. But it feels to me, I would argue that my favorite appointment in the Trump administration in the adult in the room is the 10-year bond, which is going to say, sorry, girlfriend, when I believe the president tries to implement some of these economic policies.
Konstantin, is that true? Because what I heard there is that effectively Trump had a better marketing campaign, and that reality is somewhat different from what the Americans were sold in the last election cycle.
Well, politics is about marketing, and Trump is the marketer in chief. He's very good at branding and selling ideas, and partly that's what politics is about. But in terms of the economy, I think Scott is entirely right. It's one of the reasons I admire America so much, the sense of dynamism and economic growth and the desire to create things and build things. It's an observation I've had every time I've been there. You know, if you have a successful restaurant in the UK, you go, well, I've got a successful restaurant. In America, if you have a successful restaurant, you open a second one and a third one, and you create a chain. Right. So their attitude to business more broadly is fantastic, and I love it. But I think the difference is that I don't think Americans were comparing the American economy under Joe Biden to the European economies. They were comparing the American economy under Joe Biden to the American economy under Donald Trump in his first term, and also what they expect him to do for the future. When they look at the fact that he's got real business leaders in government now, like Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, talking about government efficiency. We have to admit that all Western countries have a massively bloated civil service, what we call civil service in the UK, and the administrative state in the US, that wastes a huge amount of money that produces very little in terms of output in many cases. And that needs to be slimmed down. And people, I think, are very excited about that. And when I talk to business leaders in America, including ones that were never on the Trump train, so to speak, so many of them went over to his side in this election cycle because they just felt that he was going to continue to accelerate American growth and continue to deliver prosperity for the American people. Now, Scott's point about tariffs and all of these other things, I've listened to Donald Trump enough now to know that you should not necessarily be taking him literally. I think many of the things he says are negotiation tactics and signaling. So when he says, I'm going to build this or do that or do this, you have to sort of read between the lines. When he says, this will be the worst thing, that you just go, he's saying to people like, you better work with me, otherwise this is going to work out badly for you on all of these things. And so it remains to be seen whether he's successful in those tactics at getting what he wants. Look, America is always going to be an unequal society. It's designed in a way that is going to make it that way. In America, the focus is how do we grow the pie? In Europe, the focus is how do we divide it up so everyone gets their fair little share, right? So Americans are about expanding the pie, and then the people who bake the pie get as much of it as they possibly can. But the question is, can there be a sense in America that the American dream is alive? That you do not have to work 3 gig economy jobs to pay your rent, that you're going to be able to buy a house, that you're going to be able to afford to have children, that you're going to be able to raise a family perhaps on a single income, something that most people only dream about nowadays. That's really what this whole economic conversation is about. And we will see over the next 4 years if Donald Trump is able to slightly even change the direction of travel towards those things that actually Americans of my generation and older used to take for granted as the promise of the country that they live in.
I've thought a lot about this over the last couple of weeks in particular, because we're hearing these big headlines in national papers in the UK that millionaires are leaving the UK in historic numbers. I think it's 10,800 millionaires left last year, which is an increase of about 160% versus the previous year. And the general sentiment in terms of business confidence in the UK is at a several-year low. So I think it's the lowest it's been since just post-pandemic. There's this, I think it's the Institute of Accountants. They call up 1,000 accountants every year, and they run a survey to see how much confidence they have in business in this country. And it's fallen 14 points to 0.2% confidence in terms of business. There's this bigger narrative emerging amongst my entrepreneurial friends that if you want to start a business right now, the best place to be in the world is to be in America, is to get over to America and to leave the UK. Now, Dan, how does that square? I know you have an accelerator, you speak to lots of entrepreneurs. How does that sort of compare or contrast with what you're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, 100%. The value proposition for the UK has dropped through the floor. Very, very high tax. The ecosystem of business is in decline. Some of the smartest people are now in Dubai. Some incredible creators that I know have moved to Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai. Many are going to the USA. So if people are interested in bigger markets and bigger opportunities, they're into the USA. If they're interested in lower tax and more fringe opportunities, they're in the Middle East. Essentially, the UK hasn't found a place in the world. I think there are 3 business models the UK could go for, which is either the head office of Europe, which is what we were when we were inside the EU, and everyone used to come here to build a European business. We could be the back office of the USA, so the incubator for the USA. A lot of smart companies get to their first 50 million of value here in the UK and then sell to a US private equity firm or a US listed company. And a lot of US companies are now actually coming here to poach talent or to outsource things to the UK more cheaply than they could do it in the US. The wages in the UK are through the floor compared to what you would pay in the US, especially in tech roles. So very smart people in the UK are massively devalued. And then the third option would be to be an independent tax haven and to go with the low crime, low tax model of Dubai, Singapore, those kind of options. So we haven't really picked one of those 3 yet. We're still all these years after Brexit, and we haven't said which of those three models we want to adopt.
Scott, you moved here a couple of years ago to the UK. And despite everything that's going on in the UK, are you still bullish on this being a place for entrepreneurship and business? I was looking at some stats before we started this conversation around the sort of key areas of concern for me. Business stats I've talked about there, the drop in business confidence, the entrepreneur exodus that we're seeing, but things like knife crime in the UK are up 81% over the last decade, which I think is a symptom probably of something else. And one of the big things I think a lot about as an entrepreneur at the moment is artificial intelligence. And our investment in artificial intelligence from a global perspective is down about 2,000% versus a country like America. So you've moved here, you've brought your family here. Are you bullish on the UK versus the US from an entrepreneur's perspective?
So the question I get most frequently when I speak here is to compare and contrast the US with the UK. And I use a personal anecdote. My parents immigrated to the US from Glasgow and London when they were 19 and 22. They took enormous risks. I've been an entrepreneur my whole life. I like to think that a lot of my success isn't my fault, that I inherited sort of that risk-taking DNA. And when I speak to people in the UK, I say the primary difference is you're the ones that stayed. And that is, it kind of comes down to a risk appetite. The US has 5 times per capita the number of entrepreneurs. It has 5 times the dollar volume per startup. There's $5 million in venture capital waiting to be deployed for every startup in the US versus 1 million in Europe. I loved what Konstantin said about a restaurant. I went into this great little restaurant in Soho a few weeks ago called Dig In, and I loved it so much. I left my card and said, "Can you have the owner? I'd like to fund I'd like to open another one. Does he need money?" I just would never do that here. I thought that was a really interesting insight. And the collision of risk, crazy ideas that occasionally become crazy genius, and technology and intellectual property and great universities results in a company that no one had heard of 5 years ago being worth more than the entire UK stock market, NVIDIA. So there's just an enormous difference. The way I would summarize my impression of the UK economy, I'll just say London. I have no experience in that. I don't go anywhere that's not walking distance from Marylebone, so my bubble is pretty opaque. But the way I would describe the economy here is, I love the term the butler economy, and that is all the money I see being made here is people servicing wealth created somewhere else. You're either in financial services servicing rich people, you're either opening a restaurant or hospitality servicing rich people, but I don't see a lot of organic wealth creation. I interviewed the 2 quote unquote inventors of AI at one of your prestigious universities. My first question is, how the hell were you not able to make any money if you invented AI? Why haven't you been able to capture any money? But just for your listeners, my summation of Europe versus the US after molesting the earth for the last 35 years is US is still the best place to make money and Europe is still the best place to spend it.
Is this a failing nation, Scott?
I think you have too much going for you to be described as a failing nation. You still have amazing universities. London's still the second best city in the world. Premier League, it's an unbelievable export. I know how ridiculous that sounds. People want to be here. There's still rule of law, rule of play. You still produce amazing rock and roll. I just don't see how you could say this is a failed. I would argue that the second only to our entry into Iraq, the greatest self-inflicted wound was Brexit. An American can't understand why you would decide to increase your prices while reducing productivity in one fell swoop. It's difficult for us to wrap our heads around some of the economic decisions the UK has made, but I think a lot of people are kind of betting or hoping that the UK begins to grow again. So I'm in a weird way, I would call myself cautiously optimistic about the UK. I think at some point it begins to occupy the place it should command, if you will.